"Who do you think you're standing here?" The police officer tightened his grip on the girl's arm, his face turning crimson, his eyes filled with contempt. "I'll show you where you belong. Don't think that just because you're dressed well, I'll show you any respect." The girl was not startled. She coldly stared him in the eye. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice soft yet threatening. "You will pay for this action. I am not someone you can belittle." On a hot summer afternoon, the streets were quiet with only a few cars passing by. The summer heat seemed to seep into every brick on the road. Renee Clark, a black woman in a navy business suit and white blouse, stood near a closed bookstore. Her eyes weren't scanning the surroundings, but were fixed on the flow of people, though the alertness in her gaze was evident to anyone observant enough. She wasn't someone who easily stood out, but at that moment she stood there as if waiting for something with no sense of urgency. Her hair was neatly tied back, but her eyes were filled with caution, like someone always ready to face danger. While she waited quietly, a patrol car slowly passed by. Officer Nash sat at the wheel, gripping the steering wheel firmly. But as the car went by, he suddenly noticed Renee. There was something about her presence that made him uneasy. Nash couldn't explain why he felt this way, but it seemed he didn't like her being there. He glanced at Adams, his colleague, sitting next to him, and said nothing, just gave a subtle nod toward Renee. She stood still like a shadow in a rather empty area. There was no clear reason to stop, but the discomfort inside Nash made him feel compelled to do so. Their car slowly came to a halt by the roadside, not too close, but just enough for Nash to clearly see Renee. He observed her, trying to figure out who she was and why she was standing there at this time. An uneasy feeling surged within him, though he couldn't explain why. Adams followed Nash's gaze and then looked back at Renee, but didn't say a word. Nash didn't need any advice. He had already made up his mind. Getting out of the car, Nash walked toward Renee, his gaze filled with suspicion. This girl, though calm in appearance, made him feel something wasn't right. He couldn't just drive past without getting to the bottom of this. Renee remained motionless, as if she didn't care about his presence. Nash approached her with steady steps, his eyes full of contempt and a slight but threatening smile. "What are you doing, standing here?" He looked straight into her eyes, his tone full of sarcasm. "Don't think I know who you are. What makes you think you have the right to stand here?" Renee didn't respond immediately, her eyes unwavering. She simply stared back at him, coldly, emotionless. But that gaze seemed like a warning, making Nash suddenly feel that something was off. He continued, speaking, his tone now sharper, as if challenging her. "You think just because you're wearing a business suit, I'll respect you?" Nash lifted his chin, not hiding his contempt. "This place isn't for people like you." Nash's words carried not only discrimination, but also a direct challenge to his own authority. Renee remained silent, standing still as before, but her silence made Nash feel frustrated. He didn't want to just stand here and allow her to challenge his presence. "Put your hands behind your back," Nash ordered, his voice as hard as stone. Renee didn't immediately react. She continued to stare at him with cold eyes, as if assessing the situation. But then she slowly extended her hand behind her back, not in a hurry, not in fear. Nash didn't expect to feel uneasy in front of a woman like her. She didn't resist, didn't show fear. But inside Nash there was a feeling that he was doing something wrong. He roughly cuffed her hands, but Renee's gaze didn't waver. She looked at him calmly, as if knowing that this wouldn't end here. Suddenly, Nash felt something wasn't right. As he secured her cuffs, the eyes of the passers-by began to turn toward them. Curious, confused looks. The entire block suddenly seemed to feel as though it were being drawn into something unusual. Some people stopped staring, but no one dared to step forward. Nash glanced at the crowd watching him, then looked back at Renee. The feeling that he was doing something wrong surged inside him, but he couldn't stop. "You will face consequences," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Renee still said nothing, her eyes shining with coldness, but something in that gaze gaze made Nash feel like he didn't fully understand this woman. A sense of unease began to rise within him, but he still maintained his firm attitude. This girl, no matter how calm she seemed, was not someone he could treat like the others. The crowd continued to watch, but no one dared to intervene. This scene was not an ordinary arrest, and for Renee, this wasn't the first time she felt forced into silence by the abuse of power from those with authority. But this time she knew very well that this wouldn't end so easily. In the heavy atmosphere, an odd silence seemed to envelop everything. It was as if everyone knew Renee wouldn't let herself be overwhelmed easily. This scene wouldn't just be an ordinary arrest. It would be the beginning of a power struggle where the weak would no longer silently endure. Nash stepped back a pace, then stood looking at Renee with a face full of doubt. This girl, unlike anyone he had ever faced, stood there, her hands cuffed but her gaze still resolute without the slightest sign of fear. This made Nash feel his decisiveness begin to waver. The arrest had become a rigid performance, but not for Renee. She stood still, hands cuffed, with no reaction other than the cold stare she directed at Nash. The officer still hadn't recognized her true identity, a state lawyer, someone with far more power and status than he. But that didn't stop him. He continued to mock her, sneering with an unfriendly attitude. Adams, standing beside him, remained silent, merely observant, as though he had grown used to such scenes and didn't want to get involved in the argument. Nash grew increasingly frustrated when he didn't get any response from Renee. He believed her silence was a challenge, a disregard for his authority. "You don't think you're anyone special standing here like this, do you?" Nash asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think just because you're in a business suit I should respect you?" He became even more vicious as he saw Renee's expression, which showed no sign of panic. A sense of helplessness began to rise in him, but he couldn't let it show. He continued to escalate the tension, trying to force Renee to submit to his abuse of power. "Do you know who I am?" Nash continued repeating. "You're just an ordinary person, nothing special." He took another step closer, his face full of challenge, making the atmosphere even heavier. Passers-by, though they glanced back, remained silent, unwilling to intervene in the situation. They realized that only Renee seemed capable of facing Nash without fear. Renee still didn't resist. Her body remained straight, her eyes fixed ahead, never lowering her head. But from deep within her eyes, Nash felt a determination, and that was what frustrated him the most. The officer realized he couldn't easily break this girl like the others. He continued to push her against the wall, almost trying to control the entire space around her, and when he couldn't make her bow her head, he pushed the situation further. "You think just because you're wearing a business suit and look serious, people will respect you?" Nash mocked, his voice growing more enraged. "You're nothing to me, and you'll never escape my grasp." He grabbed her hand tightly, pulling her toward the wall as if to assert his power. His words cut into her mind like a knife, but Renee didn't waver. Her calmness only made Nash lose more control. He continued to mock her, even using harsher words. Adams stood silently beside him, not intervening in the confrontation. Officer Nash kept pushing forward completely, forgetting that he was abusing his power, that Renee was not someone who could be easily subdued. He had no idea that every word he spoke was only pushing him closer to failure, making Renee even more resolute in her determination. The situation began to escalate as Nash continued to cuff her hands. This girl, whom he thought he could easily control, was now becoming a major challenge for him. Renee still didn't say a word, showing no resistance. Her gaze remained steady, as if she already knew that what was happening was just part of a bigger plan, one that she would control. But beneath her calmness, there was a growing sense of helplessness within her. She knew she couldn't let this situation continue. This wasn't just about an arrest. It was a power struggle. In that moment, Renee felt the suffocating pressure of the cold handcuffs, a sensation she never thought she'd have to experience. People like Nash had abused this power for too long, believing they could control everything. But she wasn't an anonymous victim. She was a person of power, and this battle was just beginning. The scene seemed to have attracted the attention of those around them. Some people stopped looking in their direction, but no one dared to step in. Maybe they were intimidated by the presence of the officer, or maybe they didn't fully understand understand the situation. But the silence in the air only heightened the tension. Nash didn't realize that every move he made was bringing him closer to destroying everything he had. Officer Adams remained silent, not intervening, not offering any advice or explanation. Nash's actions would soon lead them into a serious investigation, and they would face consequences no one could foresee. "You can't escape my grasp," Nash said, but his voice was beginning to show signs of uncertainty. Renee remained silent, not moving a muscle. She knew she was winning not by resisting the officers, but by winning the internal battle within them. She had anticipated how everything would unfold, and her silence was the only response she could offer. The situation continued to escalate, but in Renee's heart, she was more resolute than ever. She knew every step she took would bring her closer to ending this abuse of power. Officers Nash and Adams were just bystanders, but her determination would change everything, and it would all be made public no matter how much they resisted her. The feeling of helplessness inside Renee was just a fleeting moment. She knew this battle wouldn't end easily, but with every minute she spent cuffed, she realized that true power never belonged to those who looked down on others. When a passerby's phone lit up, no one could have predicted that this moment would change everything. Renee remained standing silently, her hands cuffed her face, showing no fear, but her silence inadvertently highlighted the abuse of power being exhibited by Officer Nash. A man nearby holding his phone quickly recorded the scene. The footage only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to capture this tense and oppressive moment. Within minutes, the video was uploaded to social media, and no one could imagine how quickly it would spread, sparking an unprecedented wave of public outcry. Less than an hour later, the video of Renee's arrest had gone viral across social platforms. People quickly shared, commented, and expressed their outrage. The video shocked viewers not only because of the sight of a woman being unjustly cuffed, but also due to the officer's excessive behavior. Comments flooded in on posts about the incident. "Is this how the police treat an innocent woman?" one wrote. "She was just standing there, and this is how she's treated," another comment condemned. But what made people angriest was the question about racial discrimination in the incident. The question began to surface repeatedly. If she weren't a black woman, would this have happened? As it spread, the video garnered even more attention. People began questioning not just the officer's actions, but also how the police force treated black citizens in society. Those following the story on social media started to feel that this wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a larger issue: racial discrimination within law enforcement and the abuse of power they could easily exercise when dealing with those perceived as vulnerable in society. Questions about justice and human rights became more widespread. Renee had become a symbol not only of resilience, but also of all those who had been treated unjustly simply because of their skin color. Online communities began to rally around a common cause, demanding justice for Renee and holding these officers accountable for their actions. Hashtags like #JusticeForRenee and #StopPoliceBrutality quickly flooded platforms shared thousands of times. Each post not only called for justice, but also condemned the injustices that black communities face daily. That brief video was not just a captured moment. It became the catalyst for a larger social justice movement. The online community began discussing racial discrimination within the police force and how black people were unfairly treated in every situation. A series of questions about justice and the rights of black citizens in society emerged. Why do black people always have to endure discrimination was a question repeatedly asked in many posts. Do the police have the right to act this way was the next question everyone wanted an answer to. Renee, with her calm demeanor, had become the representative of everything those oppressed must endure. Her silence was a powerful response to the racial discrimination and oppression that people like her face every day. Human rights organizations immediately spoke out. These organizations were not only supporters of Renee, but also longtime advocates in the fight against racial discrimination in the justice system. They quickly sent official requests to the relevant authorities demanding a fair and thorough investigation into the actions of Nash and the other officers involved. They cannot be allowed to get away with this. Justice must be served. This was the message sent by human rights organizations, a message that was echoed by millions. Social media had become more than just a platform for daily story. It had become a battleground for justice, social equality, and human rights. Within a few hours, Renee's story became a national issue. Discussions about police power and racial discrimination began to unfold across the media. Politicians, lawyers, and social activists started speaking out. "We cannot continue to let these actions happen without consequences," a human rights leader declared at a press conference. Politicians and community leaders quickly called for an investigation and changes in the way officers behaved. Social organizations also urged the government to implement specific measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. This was a pivotal moment, not only for Renee, but for everyone fighting for justice. The battle was no longer solely in Renee's hands, but had become a struggle for society as a whole. Her story had become part of a larger movement for justice and human rights, and that movement could not be extinguished. As protests and calls for reform began to spread, those responsible for racial discrimination and abuse of power began to feel the pressure from public opinion. The online community and human rights organizations were standing up not just for Renee, but for a more just world where everyone is treated equally, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or the color of their skin. Renee's story didn't just stop at an isolated incident. It became a symbol for a greater fight. Seeing Renee cuffed but unafraid, the online community realized that this wasn't a personal issue, but a societal one. This battle was not just Renee's, but for all those who had and still were enduring discrimination and abuse of power in a society filled with injustice. The video had not just captured a moment, it had sparked a revolution. The atmosphere between Renee and the officers grew increasingly tense. Everything seemed to stop in the stillness, with only the sound of breath from those around them, who were beginning to sense the abnormality of the situation. Officer Nash still held her arm, the feeling of power rising within him. But then something changed in the way Renee looked at him. This girl was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't resisting, she wasn't angry, but she exuded a confidence that felt almost uncanny. Nash couldn't explain why he felt uneasy. Surely everything was going according to his plan. But then Renee's words shattered all those thoughts. "I'm Renee Clark, a state attorney," she said, her voice soft but sharp, as though everything around her had been predetermined. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. Nash and Adams were stunned. Their faces changed, and everything suddenly became blurry in their eyes. Renee Clark, her name echoed like a shock. A state attorney, the person they arrested, was arrested for just a hint of suspicion and prejudice. Adams stood silently, but his eyes betrayed his surprise. He turned to look at Nash, then back at Renee as though he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Nash shook his head, feeling as though he had just heard an unexpected story. He looked at Renee, his voice filled with confusion and hesitation. "You're a state attorney?" he asked again, unable to believe the very words he had just spoken. Those words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. He couldn't believe it, couldn't imagine that he had made such a serious mistake. A woman he thought was just an ordinary black woman turned out to be one of the most powerful people in society. Shock flooded Nash's eyes, and he felt as though he had been slapped hard in the face. Everything began to change immediately. The confidence, the feeling of power he had felt throughout the arrest suddenly evaporated. What he thought was a minor issue had now turned into a serious situation he couldn't untangle. Renee was not just an anonymous victim. She was a person of power and strength far beyond him. It was a shock he couldn't process right away. He had misjudged, completely misjudged. Adams also began to grasp the severity of the situation. What had started as a simple arrest was now a crisis that couldn't be anticipated. They were not just facing an innocent person being abused, but someone who could force the entire police system to change. Nash felt as if he couldn't stand his ground like a trapped animal. This feeling was something he had never prepared for, and while Nash felt that sense of loss rising within him, Renee remained completely unshaken. "You don't understand who I am," Nash said, but his voice no longer held the same confidence as before. He spoke as though threatening her, yet even he realized he no longer had the power. Renee wasn't in a rush. She just smiled faintly, but the smile was cold, as if she had already seen everything coming. "Actually, I know exactly who I am," she said, her voice calm with no anger, no tension. That response wasn't just a statement. It was a complete reversal of the situation. Everything changed in a single moment. Nash was no longer the one controlling this situation. All the tension he had created, all his abuse of power had vanished. Renee was no longer an unjustly arrested woman. She was a person with power equal to the very ones trying to oppress her. In that instant, all Nash and Adams could do was stand still and realize they had made an irreversible mistake. With a simple, yet powerful statement, Renee completely turned the tables. She was no longer the oppressed victim, but the one in control. Every action from the officers now became part of the power game she was holding. No one could dismiss her anymore. No one could treat her like an anonymous figure in their eyes. She was Renee Clark, a state attorney, someone who could change everything. That moment was not only an awakening for Nash and Adams, but for everyone watching from the outside. Renee proved that even in situations that seemed unchangeable, a person with power and resolve could alter the course of events in an instant. She had overturned all predictions, all discriminatory actions, and all forms of abuse of power that Officer Nash had committed. It was a powerful and impressive reversal of power. She didn't need to say much, just one simple sentence made the entire system listen. Nash stood still unable to believe he had ended up in such a situation. He looked at Renee as though he had lost all his strength, unable to find a way to continue this confrontation. Adams, still silent, also felt the tension in the air. He couldn't deny that in this encounter it was Renee who had full control, and that was the moment when Renee not only stood firm but became a symbol of justice. She did what many thought was impossible, not only freeing herself but also opening a chance to change the entire system. In that moment, Renee wasn't in a rush, nor did she show any fear in front of the officers facing her. Despite being handcuffed, she maintained the demeanor of someone in control of the situation. She calmly took her phone out of her pocket, unlocked the screen, and dialed a number with composure. There was no sign of urgency on her face, as though this was just another ordinary task in her life. "Please contact my people right away," Renee said, her voice steady without a hint of wavering. She didn't need to explain further. Just those 3 words were enough for her assistant to understand that the situation had crossed the normal limits. Renee knew this call would completely alter the course of events. She also knew that as soon as her assistant arrived, everything would change immediately. While Nash and Adams were still unaware of what was happening, she had taken another step forward in this power game. The scene unfolding was a confrontation that could easily be imagined, but no one present could predict the outcome. Renee wasn't worried, wasn't in a hurry. She simply waited, her eyes still fixed on Nash, as if every passing second made her control the situation more. Nash and Adams remained confused. They had no idea that Renee's call could change everything. Nothing seemed particularly unusual except that Nash continued to hold her cuffs tightly, and Adams stood there silent as if he didn't understand what was going on. But as Renee ended the call, Nash began to feel an unusual tension in the air. He looked at Adams but found no support from his partner. Both officers started to realize that they had made a grave mistake. A black FBI car pulled up right in front of them. The engine stopped, the door opened, and a group of people in black stepped out. The atmosphere immediately shifted as though an invisible wave had passed through, making everything suddenly feel much more serious. Renee didn't change her expression, still standing straight, not lowering her head, not showing any signs of confusion. She didn't even look at the arriving cars, but her sense of power and control in this situation seemed to have placed her in an entirely different position. Nash and Adams stood frozen, their eyes wide, as they watched the FBI cars. In that moment, they knew they had made an irreversible mistake. Renee was not someone they could easily handle like they had with others before. She was not just an ordinary citizen, but a person of clear authority, a state attorney, and now it seemed she had the support of a system much more powerful than theirs. Adams looked at Nash, then turned back to Renee. His gaze revealed uncertainty, clear awkwardness. He could feel the weight of the change in the air, the realization that this confrontation was no longer simple. As the FBI agents stepped out of the car and approached, Nash felt an increasing sense of unease, a feeling he had never experienced when facing similar situations. He was used to having power, used to easily controlling those he deemed weaker. But in front of him was a woman calm and fearless, and now she had the support of a force he could not match. The FBI officers moved closer, and Renee remained silent, neither rushing nor doing anything to make the situation more tense. But her silence was the most powerful display of authority in this moment. Nash looked at the FBI group, then back at Renee, and for the first time in his career, he felt helpless. The sense of losing control, as if everything he once thought he could control was no longer in his hands, washed over him. He felt small before her and before the presence of the FBI. He tried to hold his position, but inside he had lost all confidence. Adams, standing next to him, also sensed the change in the air. The FBI agents weren't just there to witness. They seemed to be part of a preparation to clarify everything. This made him feel as though he was caught in a power struggle he couldn't control. He glanced at Nash, but saw no direction from his colleague, only confusion and uncertainty. This situation was no longer just a confrontation between the police and a citizen. It had turned into a power struggle where Nash and Adams had to face a justice system they once thought they could easily manipulate. Renee, once the oppressed, had now become the one completely in control of the situation. While Nash and Adams felt their unease rise, Renee stood there silent as if nothing could shake her. The FBI convoy stopped and the atmosphere suddenly grew thick with tension. Renee didn't need to say anything more. With one phone call, she had changed the entire course of events. She hadn't just won this confrontation, she had maintained control. Nash and Adams now stood before a truth they couldn't deny. They had made a huge mistake, and not only Renee, but the entire system would witness them face the consequences of their abuse of power. The power struggle between them had shifted, and Renee was now the one in control of the situation. As soon as the video of Renee's arrest was posted, the first footage quickly spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram became the constant venues for sharing short videos and tense images of the black woman being handcuffed while police officers continued to oppress and mock her. A wave of reactions swiftly followed, with posts, comments, and shares flooding in like an unprecedented storm. Hashtags such as hashtag justice for Renee and police brutality and hashtag Black Lives Matter quickly dominated news feeds, becoming symbols of an ever-growing struggle in the online community. Everyone from celebrities to ordinary citizens expressed their outrage at the actions of Officer Nash and his team. The online community continually condemned the police's behavior, criticized racial discrimination within law enforcement, and expressed sorrow for Renee, a woman who did not deserve such injustice. justice. The videos spread rapidly, each share and comment serving as proof of the public's uncontrollable anger. A major debate erupted not only about the specific incident, but about how law enforcement treats people of color. As social media users kept speaking out, social organizations, especially human rights groups, began to take action. Calls for action quickly emerged, urging the community not to remain passive, but to take to the streets. Protests demanding justice for Renee began to be planned. More and more people calling for justice for Renee and for all the oppressed people of color in society gathered. Social organizations called for the involvement of anyone concerned about racial discrimination within the police force. Justice for Renee and justice for all the oppressed became the rallying cry in the protests. They demanded a thorough investigation into the police's abuse of power and called for a change in how law enforcement treats citizens, particularly black people. The first protests erupted not only in the local area where the incident occurred, but also spread to major cities across the country. Marches were organized with thousands of participants carrying banners demanding changes to the system and an end to racial discrimination in law enforcement. The video of Renee became a symbol of the struggle, and now her story was no longer just a personal issue, but part of a larger movement, a revolution demanding justice for all those who have been oppressed. The image of people marching hand in hand, protesting in the streets, calling for justice for Renee and those suffering from racial discrimination spread across media platforms, and no one could ignore it. At the same time, the officers in Nash's team began to feel a rise in fear. Public opinion was not only criticizing their actions, but was also demanding a fair investigation into the incident. They realized that this case could be a turning point in their careers, and its consequences might affect not only them, but the entire police force. Nash and Adams were not only afraid of being investigated, but were also concerned about the impact this incident would have on the police's reputation. Faced with such strong public criticism, they could not help but worry about what was to come. They sensed that a significant change was happening in society, and they were the ones who would have to face the consequences. Leaders within the police force, from local to high-ranking officials, began to realize the gravity of the situation. Unable to ignore the public outrage, police leadership called for a full and comprehensive investigation into the incident. An emergency meeting was immediately organized. From high-ranking police leaders to legal experts, everyone participated in discussions on how to handle the situation. They recognized that Renee's case wasn't just a wrongful arrest, but also reflected a larger issue within the policies and operations of the police force. Maintaining public trust in law enforcement was crucial, and they could not allow this situation to drag on without appropriate action. Police leader Nash could not ignore the fact that his actions had led to a major scandal which not only damaged the image of the police, but also eroded public confidence in law enforcement. Immediate change was necessary. The leaders began demanding reforms, proposing new policies to address racial discrimination within the police force. They called for stricter oversight in police recruitment and training, especially regarding racial awareness and handling situations involving people of color. They realized that a significant step forward in reform was needed if they wanted to restore public trust. Renee's situation became a powerful symbol for societal change, not only because she was a victim of racial discrimination, but because she had pushed back against the abuse of power from a system that oppressed many. Her story touched the hearts of millions and made them realize that police forces could no longer abuse their power without consequences. The online community continued to intensify the demand for justice, and human rights organizations became vigilant monitors of the investigation process and the subsequent reform. Renee had done something that not only helped her but also empowered many others to realize their own power, challenging every system of oppression and strengthening the movement for justice for those facing racial discrimination. After the video of Renee's arrest spread and sparked a wave of outrage in the community, the authorities could not ignore the situation. The case had become a national issue, and naturally, the authorities had to act. First, a team of investigators from the local police department was sent to collect evidence and interview witnesses. They began gathering video footage recorded from the mobile phones of those present at the scene. These clips became crucial evidence in verifying Officer Nash's and Officer Adams' abusive behavior. Witnesses were summoned to provide testimony, and interviews started in a tense atmosphere. The stories they shared further highlighted the severity of the racial discrimination present in the officers' action. The witnesses not only described the police officers' actions, but also provided information on the discriminatory language Nash and Adams used throughout the arrest. Despite being handcuffed and mocked, Renee remained calm enough to remember every word and action of the officers. These details were confirmed by the witnesses, painting a clear picture of the abuse of power by Nash and Adams. Each testimony, each story shared all pointed to a single fact: the racial discrimination the officers displayed in their treatment of Renee. As the investigation delved deeper, no one within the police force could deny that this incident had crossed the line. Nash and Adams could no longer defend their actions, especially as the evidence of racial discrimination and abuse of power in law enforcement became increasingly clear. Immediately, the decision to suspend both Nash and Adams was made. The two officers were no longer allowed to perform their duties and were facing an internal investigation. The suspension was not only a temporary penalty, but also a warning to others within the police force that abuse of power and racial discrimination would not be tolerated. Although Nash and Adams knew they were under investigation, neither could have predicted the significant impact this case would have on their careers and the image of law enforcement in general. Meanwhile, the interviews continued and more details were brought to light. Renee, who had been wrongfully arrested, began to become a symbol for justice in society. The people who witnessed the incident, from those standing in the neighborhood to those involved in the video, spoke up in support of her, demanding a fair investigation. These individuals not only condemned the actions of Nash and Adams, but also raised questions about how law enforcement routinely treats black people. Human rights organizations also continued to urge the authorities to take strong measures to prevent racial discrimination within policing practices. The social community, especially online communities, continued to apply pressure. Organizations like Black Lives Matter quickly organized protests demanding justice for Renee and for all those oppressed by racial discrimination within the police force. Human rights organizations kept pushing the authorities to deal severely with Nash and Adams, not only to restore justice for Renee, but also to show that racial discrimination in law enforcement would not be tolerated. The more the social community spoke out, the larger the protests for justice for Renee grew, with thousands taken to the streets to demand changes in the police system. These organizations not only called for a fair investigation, but also pushed for comprehensive reforms in how the police interact with the community. With each passing day, the public's outrage grew stronger, and the call for reform reached new heights. The images from protests and social media discussions reflected an undeniable truth: the police force could not continue operating this way without consequences. Abuse of power had become a major issue in society, and Renee was no longer just a victim, but a symbol of justice leading the fight for fairness for the oppressed. Nash and Adams still faced the investigation, but no matter how hard they tried to justify their actions, the truth remained unchanged. They had made a grave mistake, and now they could not avoid the consequences of their abuse of power. The sense of unease was becoming more apparent, and they understood that this investigation would not be easy. If the investigation proves they committed serious violations, they would not only lose their jobs, but also face legal consequences. This caused them to fear not only for their careers, but also for their own sense of justice in the eyes of the public. They could no longer deny the truth. This story was not just about Renee, but about society as a whole, about how to protect the rights of those who face racial discrimination and how to build a truly fair justice system. The next steps in this investigation would be a major test for all those involved in reforming the legal system and law enforcement in society. The community, human rights organizations, and justice advocates would not allow racial discrimination and abuse of power in law enforcement to continue. They would keep fighting for change, for a more just society where everyone is treated equally. For Nash and Adams, the consequences were unavoidable. They had entered a battle not only with Renee, but with the entire community and the justice system. The investigation and public outrage would not stop until the truth was revealed and justice was served. The internal investigation into Renee's case reached its conclusion after days of intense scrutiny and careful examination of the evidence. Investigators reviewed each video recording the actions of Nash and Adams, interviewed witnesses, and examined reports. Ultimately, the conclusion of the internal investigation was clear. The actions of Officer Nash and Adams were wrong and violated citizens' rights, specifically their use of power in a brutal and racially discriminatory manner during Renee's arrest was strongly criticized. Investigators clearly identified abuse of power in each action of these officers. Not only did they have no legitimate reason to stop and arrest Renee, but they also displayed blatant racial discrimination through their words and behavior throughout the incident. Every detail proved that this was not just a mistake in their duties, but a serious violation of a citizen's rights, particularly the right to be treated fairly without racial discrimination. The investigation's conclusion was publicly released, and it came as no surprise that Nash and Adams faced severe consequences. A disciplinary decision was made immediately, and the two officers could not avoid being placed on suspension while awaiting further investigation results. Nash and Adams were temporarily suspended, a punishment imposed instantly and made public soon after the news of their dismissal spread. This was not only a shock to Nash and Adams, but also to the entire police force. For those accustomed to abuse of power and racial discrimination, being severely disciplined sent a clear message that no one is above the law. They could no longer work in law enforcement without respecting the rights of citizens, especially those from vulnerable communities. This decision was part of an effort to restore public trust in the justice system. The outrage from the community continued to grow. While officers Nash and Adams had been disciplined, the social community felt that this was just the first step. Particularly within the black community, which had endured racial discrimination for many years, calls for comprehensive reforms in the police force persisted. Human rights organizations and those fighting for civil rights began to intensify their calls for immediate change. They not only demanded harsh punishment for Nash and Adams, but also called for a complete overhaul in how the police treat the public, especially minority groups. Renee's story sparked a strong wave of opposition and ignited a movement calling for changes in the entire police system. Protesters took to the streets, and justice supporters kept demanding that police misconduct and racial discrimination come to an end. Social organizations strongly urged the government to take decisive action to address racial discrimination within the police force. Calls were made for increased oversight and transparency in police activities. They demanded an independent monitoring system to track police behavior and ensure that no acts of abuse of power went undetected or unaddressed in a timely manner. Justice should not only be enforced through disciplinary decisions, but also accompanied by measures to prevent similar misconduct from occurring in the future. In response to the community's demands, police leaders began implementing new policies and procedures. These changes were not only aimed at reducing racial discrimination within the police force, but also at creating a fairer and more transparent work environment. The new policies included enhanced training for police officers officers on racial awareness, communication skills, and handling situations impartially. Officers would undergo regular training sessions, and audits would be conducted to ensure that all police actions were monitored and evaluated fairly. At the same time, investigations into misconduct would become stricter. An independent monitoring system would be established to ensure that any wrongdoing by the police would be investigated and addressed promptly. Human rights organizations and the community would continue to closely monitor the enforcement of these policies to ensure that the promises of reform were not just empty words. As these reforms were implemented, Renee continued to stand as a symbol of justice and resilience. Her story was no longer just about being a victim of racial discrimination, but had become a symbol for the fight for civil rights. She not only wanted to change her own fate, but also to create a more just world for all the oppressed. The community continued to support her, and calls for a fairer society continued to echo loudly. With the investigation results and reforms beginning to take effect, Renee accomplished something she hadn't anticipated. Not only did she reclaim justice for herself, but she also triggered significant societal change, especially within the police force. She helped others realize that a simple action, a timely stand, could change the entire system. Her case became a turning point in the struggle for justice and human rights, and a great lesson for society about never backing down in the face of injustice. Renee's story will never be forgotten. Reforms in the police system will continue to be implemented, and every step taken in this fight brings hope to those who want to see a just society where the rights of everyone are protected regardless of skin color or social status. The official trial began in an atmosphere of intense tension, attracting the attention not only of human rights organizations, but also of major media outlets. Renee Clark sat in the courtroom, her gaze steadfast, undeterred by the scrutiny of hundreds of onlookers. This was not just a personal lawsuit, but a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police force. Every detail of the case was exposed to the public, and everyone understood that the outcome of this trial would not only determine the fate of Nash and Adams, but could also change how the police interact with citizens in society. Those following the case understood that this was an opportunity to restore justice and send a clear message that abuses of power cannot exist in a fair legal system. Throughout the trial, witnesses were called to testify about the events. Those present at the scene the day Renee was arrested, including the person who recorded the video, were asked to provide detailed statements. The viral videos became crucial evidence in clarifying the actions of officers Nash and Adam. The footage not only captured the officers' brutal actions, but also clearly demonstrated racial discrimination and how they treated Renee. The testimonies of witnesses combined with the undeniable evidence from the videos painted a complete picture of police abuse of power, making the incident inexcusable. Each testimony further highlighted the racial discrimination and harsh attitudes displayed by the officers throughout the ordeal. The witnesses were not only those who were present in the neighborhood that day, but also those who witnessed the confrontation through their phone screens. Their video was not just a recording. It was irrefutable evidence of injustice. Questions from Renee's attorney made everyone in the courtroom reflect on racial discrimination, how the police use power, and the consequences of those actions. Each question, every detail emphasized, revealed a painful truth about racism within the police force. The witnesses, although they may not have known all the details about Renee, were united in criticizing the officer's behavior. The rising sense of anger and injustice as they shared what they had witnessed made those in the courtroom more aware of the severity of the case. With irrefutable evidence and witness testimonies, the trial neared a clear conclusion. Nash and Adams could not avoid taking responsibility for their wrongful actions. The verdict was delivered, and although the two officers no longer had the power to influence the situation, the community's reaction did not stop. People, especially online communities and human rights organizations, continued to apply pressure for stronger measures against such behavior. failure. Renee's story had sparked a wave forcing everyone to confront racial discrimination in society and within the police force. Actions like those of Nash and Adams not only harmed Renee personally, but also reflected a larger societal issue that needed to be addressed. The outrage from the community continued to grow after the trial concluded. Human rights organizations not only kept calling for reform within the police force, but also demanded that the legal system implement strong measures to address abuses of power strictly. They urged the government and relevant authorities to ensure that wrongful acts within the police force could no longer continue unchecked. Renee had become a symbol of resilience in the fight for justice. Her actions not only changed her own fate, but also opened up opportunities for a more just society. Every step Renee took from standing up to the police to becoming victorious in court was a testament to the strength of those who dared to stand up against injustice. The outcome of the trial confirmed that justice is not just an abstract concept, but a fundamental right for every citizen. Both Renee and her supporters understood that while the trial's verdict might bring compensation for her, the more important outcome was changing societal awareness about justice and human rights. This story did not end with the court's verdict. It continued to live in social discussions and the struggles for justice that Renee had sparked. The courtroom that day was packed with tension so thick it felt palpable. Every eye was on Renee, who sat silently, yet her calmness radiated an undeniable strength. Media outlets were present, cameras constantly trained on her, capturing every significant moment. They knew this was not just an ordinary trial, but a turning point for justice. Nash, the accused officer, now stood before justice to face his actions. He stood there no longer confident like he was when he was an officer, but his confusion was evident in his eyes. Renee's story had begun to change his life, and it wasn't just affecting him. It was part of a larger struggle for justice for all those who faced racial discrimination. Each of Renee's statements was sharp, determined, and left no room for Nash or the defense lawyers to escape guilt. She not only spoke for herself, but also for all those who had been abused, for those who had been mistreated by the police simply because of their skin color. She didn't show tension, but every word she spoke carried the power of truth. Nash tried to maintain his composure, but in those moments his eyes betrayed his disappointment. He knew that Renee's statements were not only accurate, but also an irrefutable accusation. The questions from her lawyer made everything clearer than ever. Nash could not deny his actions, the racist comments, and the oppressive acts he committed all laid bare in court. The court continued questioning and gathering more evidence, and finally the verdict was delivered. Everyone in the courtroom waited in silence. After tense hours, the judge read the verdict in a low voice, each word pushing for a significant change in the legal system. Nash was found guilty of racial discrimination and abuse of power. This decision not only impacted his life directly, but also created a ripple within the police force and society. The court showed that such actions could not continue to be tolerated in a just society where citizens' rights must be protected. This verdict marked a new chapter in addressing racial discrimination cases. It was not only compensation for Renee, but also a clear message to society: abuse of power in the police force would not be ignored. This was not just a victory for Renee, but for all those who have been and are still fighting against racial discrimination and abuse of power in the legal system. For the first time in many years, justice was served clearly and publicly. Nash's conviction was a turning point not just in his career, but also a profound lesson for all police officers about not disregarding citizens' rights, especially in racial matters. This event forced the police force to confront a painful reality. It wasn't just an isolated incident, but the tip of an iceberg in a system that needed reform. Everything was exposed. Racial discrimination not only existed in society, but was also present among those entrusted with upholding justice. The community proved that no one, whether police or citizens, could stand above the law when committing wrongful acts. The wave of outrage from the community continued to rise, demanding not only strict action against the corrupt officers, but also pushing for reforms within the police force to ensure no one would face such discrimination again. The court's decision would not just stop at punishing Nash and Adams, but was a significant step toward building a fair legal system where all citizens are treated equally. Those who had suffered from racial discrimination and oppression would no longer be silenced. They would have the right to speak up and demand justice, and more importantly, justice would no longer be a distant hope. Renee's story will never be forgotten. After the trial concluded, attention did not end with the verdict in the case involving Nash and Adams. The community and human rights organizations realized that this was not just a personal incident, but part of a larger issue: racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police force. Human rights organizations quickly called for a deeper investigation, not only into the actions of the officers in this case, but also into the overall practices of the police, particularly how they treated communities of color. Racial discrimination was not rare within the police force, and this investigation was not just to identify individual wrongdoers, but to address a system that perpetuated injustice. Immediately, international and human rights organizations began joining the investigation, demanding comprehensive reforms in how the police force operates. These organizations, from Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch, not only voiced their support for Renee, but also called on authorities to conduct a thorough investigation into the entire police system to better understand the wrongful practices this force may be engaging in. Specifically, they demanded more transparency and stricter oversight in police recruitment and training, as well as monitoring officers' behavior during their duties. They argued that Renee's case was just one of many similar incidents occurring nationwide, and the critical issue was whether these racist behaviors were being condoned by police agencies' policies. Human rights organizations called for independent investigations to oversee police actions, ensuring that incidents like this would not happen again and that offending officers would be held accountable. Surveys on racial discrimination within the police force were conducted, and substantial evidence was gathered to prove the existence of this issue for many years. The international community began to pay more attention to the investigations and the responses from authorities. Political leaders began speaking out, demanding a comprehensive overhaul of the police force. However, human rights organizations did not stop at calling for investigations. They also demanded new policies to end racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police force. These organizations intensified campaigns calling for reforms in the legal system and police policies to ensure that justice was fairly served for all citizens regardless of race or social standing. They called on the government to implement measures to protect citizens from discrimination and oppression, and to ensure that a public institution like the police would not wield power without oversight and accountability. Following the conclusion of the trial, attention did not stop with the verdict in the case involving Nash and Adams. The community and human rights organizations recognized that this was not just an individual incident, but part of a larger issue: racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police force. Human rights organizations quickly called for a deeper investigation, not only into the officers' actions in this case, but into the overall practices of the police, particularly how they treated communities of color. Racial discrimination was not uncommon in the police force, and this investigation was not just about identifying individual wrongdoers, but also about addressing a system that perpetuates injustice. Immediately, international and human rights organizations joined the investigation, calling for comprehensive reforms in how the police force operates. Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch not only voiced their support for Renee, but also urged authorities to conduct a thorough investigation into the entire police system to better understand the wrongful practices the force may be engaging in. Specifically, they demanded more transparency and stricter oversight in police recruitment and training, as well as monitoring their behavior while on duty. They They argued that Renee's case was just one of many similar incidents happening nationwide, and it was critical to determine whether these racially discriminatory behaviors were condoned by police agencies' policies. Human rights organizations advocated for independent investigations to oversee police actions, ensuring that incidents like this would not happen again and that offending officers would be held accountable. Surveys on racial discrimination within the police force were conducted, and significant evidence was gathered to show the existence of this issue over the years. The international community began paying more attention to the investigations and the responses from authorities. Political leaders started speaking out, demanding a comprehensive overhaul of the police force. However, human rights organizations didn't stop at calling for investigations. They also demanded new policies to end racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police. These organizations pushed forward campaigns demanding reforms in the legal system and police policies to ensure justice was fairly served for all citizens regardless of race or social status. They called on the government to implement measures to protect citizens from discrimination and oppression and to ensure that a public institution like the police would not hold power without oversight and accountability. These ongoing dialogues and investigations began to shift public awareness. People who once believed that justice was solely a matter for law enforcement began to understand that justice belongs to everyone. Reform was not just a change in how the police operate, but also a shift in how society views the rights and fairness of all citizens. The expanded investigation and these dialogues were the first steps in rebuilding public trust in the legal system. Renee's story became an important milestone, not only because of Nash and Adams's wrongdoing, but also because it opened the door to re-examining the role of the police in modern society. Her story was not just a personal battle, but a victory for human rights and a step forward in the fight for justice for all. Following the historic lawsuit initiated by Renee, a wave of reform began to spread through the police system. Reform policies were immediately implemented, aiming to change how the police treat citizens, especially racially marginalized groups. Training on racial awareness and justice was incorporated into mandatory training programs for all officers. These weren't just theoretical lessons, but practical training sessions to help officers better understand human rights and appropriate conduct in sensitive situations. The training focused not only on justice, but also on raising awareness about racial discrimination, aiming to eliminate unconscious biases in police work. The program was designed to ensure that officers not only learned but also changed their attitudes, helping them understand the importance of treating all citizens equally. In addition to the training, an independent monitoring system was established to oversee police actions during duty. This system would not only monitor officers' behavior in specific situations, but also review daily reports to detect any misconduct. These checks would be conducted regularly and with full transparency, with results made public for all to see. The goal was to ensure that officers could not act arbitrarily without being noticed, while also protecting citizens' rights and restoring trust in the police force within the community. Reports on police behavior would be updated monthly and published on official platforms to ensure transparency. This would not only allow the community to track the progress of the reforms, but also create an effective monitoring mechanism holding the police accountable to the public. Human rights organizations and justice advocacy groups would have access to these reports and participate in the oversight process, ensuring that officers would no longer abuse their power. Publicly available reports would also help build trust between the police and the community, especially with groups that had historically suffered from racial discrimination and abuse of power. With these changes, the police force would no longer be just an organization with unchecked power, but one that adheres to the rules and ethical values established through reform. Officers would now be trained not only to enforce the law, but also to be part of the community, respecting respecting everyone's rights, regardless of who they are. These changes weren't just superficial reforms, but represented a shift in how the police understood and implemented justice. However, these reforms were not an easy process, and they could not be implemented immediately. For these reforms to truly take effect, the involvement of everyone from the government and social organizations to police officers was required. Changes in training and oversight might face resistance from some members of the police force who were still accustomed to their absolute power. Nevertheless, with strong support from the community and human rights organizations, these reforms were gradually becoming a reality. More importantly, these reforms would not only change how the police treat citizens, but also reshape the relationship between justice and power in society. After the reforms were implemented, police leaders began to realize that they could no longer maintain old policies. The system required a profound change to serve a fairer society, and these reforms were the first step. Despite opposition from some of Nash's colleagues who felt that these changes would reduce police power and freedom of action resistance gradually became unstoppable. More and more senior police leaders recognized that this struggle was not just about Renee, but about the development of a comprehensive legal system. These reforms could not remain just promises. They had to be put into practice. Police commanders understood that in order to restore public trust and reduce racial discrimination, they needed to adjust how the force operated. Policies and procedures within the police force had to change with stricter controls and oversight, and most importantly, every officer had to receive fair training and be fully aware of racial discrimination issues. Despite opposition from some colleagues, especially senior officers accustomed to the old ways of working, change could not be stopped. Police leaders knew that to maintain the community's respect, they could not allow abuses of power like those in Nash and Adams's case to continue. They had to set an example, implement the reforms society demanded, and show that they were ready to change to align with modern justice demands. Though opposition remained, the change had begun and could not be reversed. Pushing forward, reforms in training and monitoring officers was the first important step in rebuilding trust and creating a more just police force. However, even with reforms implemented, the community continued to play an essential role in overseeing the implementation of the new policies. This was especially important given that human rights organizations and the community were still monitoring every step of the police force. These reforms could not rely solely on the legal system or internal changes within the police force. They required the involvement of society at large. The community, particularly those who had been affected by racial discrimination in the past, maintained a strong oversight role to ensure that the reforms were not merely symbolic. Publicly available reports on police actions, especially through independent checks and fair training courses, would help ensure that these reforms were not just on paper, but resulted in real change. Renee's story sparked significant change, not only in her own case, but within the entire police system. She was not just a personal victor, but a symbol of a justice movement reflecting the necessity to change how the police treated citizens, particularly vulnerable groups in society. This event forced police authorities to face difficult truths and sparked a larger societal dialogue about fairness and human rights. The community and human rights organizations continued to demand deeper reforms, and while progress had been made, the process of change was still ongoing. Those who once remained silent in the face of racial discrimination were no longer willing to accept injustice. They would continue to fight to ensure that these reforms were not just words, but real actions aimed at building a fairer society for all. Thus, while the reforms in the police force had begun to take shape, the community still played a crucial role in oversight. These changes would not succeed without the involvement of society, and Renee's story marked a significant turning point in the fight against racial discrimination and abuse of power within the police force. After the lawsuit, Renee became not only the winner in her legal battle, but also a living symbol of resilience and justice. She overcame not just the challenges of her own case, but also stood firm in the face of the adversities that many others in society face. Renee was not just reclaiming her personal rights, she was also bringing about a significant change in how the community views and fights for human rights. Her story became an inspiration not only for the oppressed, but also for everyone who believes that justice can prevail. The image of her standing tall and calm amidst pressure seemed to send a powerful message about never backing down in the face of injustice. Human rights organizations immediately honored Renee, recognizing her as a symbol of the struggle for justice and equality. These organizations not only praised her resilience, but also regarded her as a leader, someone who courageously stood up when the legal system appeared to overlook the rights of people like her. She became a role model for those suffering from racial discrimination and abuse of power within public institutions. Renee represented a generation unwilling to accept injustice and always seeking justice no matter the cost. Not only human rights organizations, but also the broader community expressed deep respect for Renee. Civil rights groups organized numerous protests and events to honor her contributions in pushing for societal change. Renee was not just honored at these events, she became the leader of campaigns demanding reform in police policies. These campaigns did not just focus on seeking justice for her, but expanded into a movement calling for changes in the police system, with the goal of creating a fair and equal environment for all citizens. She became the leading figure in the fight for police accountability, and more importantly, she stood up for comprehensive reforms in how the police exercise power. These campaigns attracted thousands of people from all over, united in the goal of protecting citizens' rights, particularly minority groups, and promoting police system changes to minimize racial discrimination and abuse of power. Renee was not only the winner in court, but also the catalyst for a wave of justice pushing society forward. The online community, human rights organizations, and many individuals viewed Renee as a symbol of a revolution not only within the police force, but also in how society perceives human rights. The honor bestowed upon her was not just for her personal victory, but also for recognizing the immense effort she had put in to create a fairer world. She became a beacon of hope for those who had suffered injustice, helping them believe that even in the most challenging circumstances, victory is possible with perseverance. For Renee, victory did not just come from the court's ruling, but from the strength of resilience and the solidarity of those fighting for the rights of all people. After the lawsuit, Renee became not only the winner in her legal battle, but also a living symbol of resilience and justice. She overcame not just the challenges of her own case, but also stood firm in the face of the adversities that many others in society face. Renee was not just reclaiming her personal rights, she was also bringing about a significant change in how the community views and fights for human rights. Her story became an inspiration not only for the oppressed, but also for everyone who believes that justice can prevail. The image of her standing tall and calm amidst pressure seemed to send a powerful message about never backing down in the face of injustice. Human rights organizations immediately honored Renee, recognizing her as a symbol of the struggle for justice and equality. These organizations not only praised her resilience, but also regarded her as a leader, someone who courageously stood up when the legal system appeared to overlook the rights of people like her. She became a role model for those suffering from racial discrimination and abuse of power within public institutions. Renee represented a generation unwilling to accept injustice and always seeking justice no matter the cost. Not only human rights organizations, but also the broader community expressed deep respect for Renee. Civil rights groups organized numerous protests and events to honor her contributions in pushing for societal change. Renee was not just honored at these events. she became the leader of campaigns demanding reform in police policies. These campaigns did not just focus on seeking justice for her, but expanded into a movement calling for changes in the police system with the goal of creating a fair and equal environment for all citizens. She became the leading figure in the fight for police accountability, and more importantly, she stood up for comprehensive reforms in how the police exercise power. These campaigns attracted thousands of people from all over United in the goal of protecting citizens' rights, particularly minority groups, and promoting police system changes to minimize racial discrimination and abuse of power. Renee was not only the winner in court, but also the catalyst for a wave of justice pushing society forward. The online community, human rights organizations, and many individuals viewed Renee as a symbol of a revolution not only within the police force, but also in how society perceives human rights. The honor bestowed upon her was not just for her personal victory, but also for recognizing the immense effort she had put in to create a fairer world. She became a beacon of hope for those who had suffered injustice, helping them believe that even in the most challenging circumstances, victory is possible with perseverance. For Renee, victory did not just come from the court's ruling, but from the strength of resilience and the solidarity of those fighting for the rights of all people. Since her lawsuit gained widespread attention, Renee's story has been shared extensively on social platforms from Facebook to Twitter, continuing to spread everywhere. Images, videos, and articles related to her became an inspiration for millions worldwide. She was not only known as a woman who suffered racial discrimination and abuse of power, but also as a hero who stood up against injustice. Her story, filled with moving and inspiring details, quickly spread, changing how society viewed Black people and minority groups. Discussions about racial discrimination and civil rights began to flourish in public conversations. She did what many thought was impossible. She shed light on injustice and fought for change in a system that had perpetuated racial discrimination for years. Social media became not just a platform for sharing Renee's story, but also a space to drive action. Human rights organizations began organizing large campaigns calling for the government to implement comprehensive police reforms. Renee became the symbol of this movement, someone people turned to for motivation to continue fighting. Articles about her not only condemned racial discrimination, but also called for greater reforms in the legal system, from changes in police training to the establishment of independent oversight mechanisms for police actions. Step by step, her story made the public realize that change cannot happen without everyone's participation. Renee's story also sparked a larger discussion about the need to change the way the justice system operates. Questions about racial discrimination within the police force were raised not only in protests, but also became a hot topic in political meetings. Political leaders began to realize that without changes in the way the police operate, justice could not be fairly administered for all. Renee became a symbol of resilience, and her story transcended a single lawsuit to become part of a larger movement for justice in society. Renee's story continues to live on in the hearts of the public, reminding everyone of their rights and the possibility of changing a system many once thought inviolable. She was not just a victim of racial discrimination, but a victor who paved the way for a fairer future for all. She proved that when we unite and fight for what's right, change is entirely possible. After Renee's case became a national event, political leaders could no longer remain on the sideline. The public outrage and protests demanding justice created immense pressure on those in power. Political leaders began making public statements about the need for police reform. They understood that justice wasn't just about punishing the offending officers, but about changing the entire police system. Through her story, Renee became the embodiment of what society expects from a truly truly just legal system. Politicians started committing to making necessary changes, not only to address the specific case, but also to prevent similar mistakes in the future. Their commitment was not just a promise, but a firm declaration that the government would do everything necessary to ensure that all citizens, regardless of race or origin, would have equal rights and opportunities. However, while political leaders made compelling statements, a large portion of the community felt these changes needed to be implemented immediately, not just as empty promises. To address the tension and demand for reform, meetings were held between political leaders, the police force, and the community. These meetings were not just dialogues between government agencies, but also an opportunity for citizens and human rights organizations to express their views on police reform. These discussions held special significance in the context of a society demanding major change. Political leaders could no longer sit in silence. They had to demonstrate a true commitment to reform. The police had to participate in these discussions as well. They could not stand by while reform was happening without their involvement. Police leaders also had to face the reality that the public would no longer accept the old ways of doing things, but were demanding a complete overhaul. These meetings didn't just focus on policy reforms, but also included concrete measures to improve the relationship between the police and the community. Political leaders called for an independent oversight system to monitor police behavior, ensuring that abuses of power and racial discrimination would no longer occur. Additionally, programs on racial awareness and justice were incorporated into the discussions aimed at helping the police better understand the challenges the community faces, thereby changing how they enforce the law. These meetings were places to find solutions not only to correct past mistakes, but to prevent similar issues from arising in the future. While these meetings were a step forward in police reform, compromise remained a significant challenge. Political leaders faced opposition from parts of the police force who felt that they were being imposed new conditions and standards they had never been required to follow before. However, the pressure from the public, especially from human rights organizations and the community, could not be ignored. Political leaders understood that if they didn't implement reform immediately, they would lose the public's trust and would not be able to rebuild confidence in the legal system. Ultimately, these discussions led to an important decision: the government would take concrete measures, change the way the police operated, and improve the relationship with the community. Although not all issues were resolved immediately, these steps were necessary to ensure that justice would be enforced more fairly in the future. After Renee's case became a national event, political leaders could no longer stay on the sidelines. The public outrage and protests demanding justice created immense pressure on those in power. Political leaders began making public statements about the need for police reform. They realized that justice was not just about punishing the officers who misbehave, but also about changing the way the entire police system operates. Through her story, Renee became a model for what society expects from a truly just legal system. Politicians started committing to the necessary changes, not only to address the specific case, but also to prevent similar mistakes in the future. Their commitment was not just a promise, but a clear affirmation that the government would do everything in its power to ensure that all citizens, regardless of race or origin, would have equal rights and opportunities. However, while political leaders made compelling statements, a large portion of the community still felt that these changes needed to be implemented immediately, not just as empty promises. To address the tension and demand for reform, meetings were held between political leaders, the police force, and the community. These meetings were not just dialogues between government agencies, but also an opportunity for citizens and human rights organizations to express their views on police reform. These discussions had special significance in the context of a society demanding significant change. Political leaders could no longer remain silent. They had to demonstrate a true commitment to reform. The police had had to participate in these discussions as well. They could not stand by while reform was happening without their involvement. Police leaders also had to face the reality that the public no longer accepted the old ways of doing things, but were demanding a complete overhaul. These meetings didn't just focus on policy reforms, but also included concrete measures to improve the relationship between the police and the community. Political leaders called for an independent oversight system to monitor police behavior, ensuring that abuses of power and racial discrimination would no longer occur. Additionally, programs on racial awareness and justice were incorporated into the discussions aimed at helping the police better understand the challenges the community face, thus changing how they enforce the law. These meetings were places to find solutions not only to correct past mistakes, but to prevent similar issues from arising in the future. While these meetings were a step forward in police reform, compromise remained a significant challenge. Political leaders faced opposition from parts of the police force who felt they were being imposed new conditions and standards they had never been required to follow before. However, the pressure from the public, especially from human rights organizations and the community, could not be ignored. Political leaders understood that if they didn't implement reform immediately, they would lose the public's trust and would not be able to rebuild confidence in the legal system. Ultimately, these discussions led to an important decision. The government would take concrete measures, change the way the police operated, and improve the relationship with the community. Although not all issues were resolved immediately, these steps were necessary to ensure that justice would be enforced more fairly in the future. After the lawsuit ended with a favorable verdict for Renee, she became a symbol of resilience and justice. Her story was not just about a legal case, but about the tireless fight for human rights and justice. Her courage and perseverance touched the hearts of millions worldwide, making them realize that justice can be served even in the most difficult circumstances. Thanks to her strong influence, Renee was honored at an international conference on justice and human rights. There, she received praise from international organizations and became a spokesperson for many campaigns advocating for justice. She was invited to participate in major forums where she could share her story and inspire those facing injustice. She represented not only herself, but also became the voice for those who had never been heard, those who had suffered from discrimination and oppression in society. Renee's speeches were not just about her life, but a powerful message about human rights, equality, and justice, urging people to think and act. She became a symbol of a revolution demanding change in society, especially in how public systems treat citizens. At the conference, Renee inspired many, especially women, who had faced and continue to face racial discrimination and injustice in society. She shared her struggles from being wrongfully arrested to facing racial discrimination in public institutions. But instead of being defeated, she used those challenges to affirm her rights and the rights of others. Renee was not just a personal winner, but became a beacon for those who were oppressed. She proved that even when facing powerful forces like the police system, standing up with resilience and trust in justice can bring about change. She is living proof that the power of an individual, when determined and brave, can create significant societal change. Despite her great victory, Renee did not stop. She continued her legal work not only for personal reasons, but to keep fighting for the oppressed. She returned to her legal career where her journey began, but this time she was no longer someone who silently endured injustice. She became a protector of those who couldn't protect themselves, especially those discriminated against. She helped the poor, the voiceless, and brought hope to them as they faced difficult legal battles. Renee didn't just keep fighting in the legal field. She also became a leader in social reform campaigns. She was part of the justice movement, and by continuing to contribute to the legal field, she proved that justice is never out of reach. She helped others understand that they too have the right to speak out and change a system that had long neglected their right. After the lawsuit concluded with a favorable favorable verdict for Renee, she became a symbol of resilience and justice. Her story wasn't just about a lawsuit. It was about an unwavering struggle for human rights and justice. Her courage and persistence touched the hearts of millions worldwide, showing them that justice can prevail even in the most challenging circumstances. Thanks to her powerful influence, Renee was honored at an international conference on justice and human rights. There, she was not only praised by international organizations but also became the spokesperson for numerous justice campaigns. She was invited to major forums where she could share her story and inspire those facing injustice. She not only represented herself but also became the voice of those who had never been heard, those who had suffered from discrimination and oppression. Renee's speeches were not just about her life but a powerful message about human rights, equality, and justice, compelling people to think and act. She became a symbol of a revolution demanding change in society, especially in how public systems treat citizens. At the conference, Renee inspired many, especially women, who had faced and continue to face racial discrimination and injustice in society. She shared her struggles from being wrongfully arrested to enduring racial discrimination in public institutions. But instead of being defeated, she used those challenges to affirm her rights and the rights of others. Renee wasn't just a personal victor. She became a beacon for those oppressed. She proved that even when up against powerful forces like the police system, standing up with resilience and belief in justice can bring change. She is living proof that the power of an individual, when determined and courageous, can create significant societal change. Despite her great victory, Renee did not stop. She continued her legal work not only for personal reasons, but to keep fighting for the oppressed. She returned to her legal career where her journey began, but this time she was no longer someone who silently endured injustice. She became a protector of those who couldn't protect themselves, especially those discriminated against. She helped the poor, the voiceless, and brought hope to them as they faced difficult legal battles. Renee didn't just keep fighting in the legal field. She also became a leader in social reform campaigns. She was part of the justice movement, and by continuing to contribute to the legal field, she proved that justice is never out of reach. She helped others understand that they too have the right to speak out and change a system that had long neglected their right. Renee's story did not end with a harsh sentence for those who abuse their power. It became a profound reflection of how society operates and why it must change. From heated debates on social media to political forums, the name Renee was mentioned as living proof of the power of justice when it is defended to the very end. People began to question not only the police force, but the entire legal, educational, and media systems for their role in either reinforcing or dismantling prejudice against marginalized groups. Many realized that racism does not only exist in spontaneous street incidents, but also seeps into thinking, into choices of behavior, and even into decisions that seem objective. That story forced them to look back at themselves and consider how they contributed to either maintaining or breaking down social barriers. From there, the wave of reform spread beyond the police. Schools began to include lessons on equality and cultural diversity awareness in their curricula. Businesses organized employee training to eliminate implicit bias. Local governments issued policies encouraging the participation of minority groups in leadership and decision-making roles. People no longer saw Renee's story as just a legal victory, but as the beginning of a long journey to fundamentally change how humans view and treat one another. This made society more alert to every sign of injustice while fostering a personal sense of responsibility for protecting human rights. In the local community, change was evident in acts of solidarity never seen before. Social organizations worked more closely together, focusing not only on reacting when incidents occurred, but also on preventing them at their roots. They organized meetings between residents and law enforcement so both sides could better understand each other, easing doubts and fears that had lasted for generations. Many volunteer youth groups were formed to go into areas at high risk of conflict, listening, advising and connecting people to available support resources. These efforts not only reduced community tensions but also laid the foundation for a more united and sustainable society. Organizations working for social justice also received more public support than ever. Online fundraising campaigns repeatedly broke records, allowing them to expand operations and launch new initiatives. From providing free legal aid to victims of discrimination to lobbying for policies at the national level, every action bore the mark of the spirit that Renee had ignited. Remarkably, it was not only those who had experienced injustice who joined in. People who had once stayed on the sidelines now stepped forward, understanding that silence was equivalent to complicity. The change was also reflected in how the media reported the news. Many newspapers and television channels began reviewing their choice of words and images to avoid unintentionally reinforcing stereotypes. Journalists joined fair journalism training programs, learning how to approach stories with respect and thoroughness. Social media platforms also faced pressure to better control discriminatory or inflammatory content while giving priority to spreading positive stories like Renee's journey. The fact that one individual could bring about systemic change became proof for both the press and the public that the right story would find its way into people's hearts if it was told and defended in the right way. More importantly, the lesson from Renee made the community realize that justice does not exist on its own without someone brave enough to defend it. Her courage broke the silence and sparked a spirit of resistance against wrongdoing. It encouraged those who had once stayed quiet out of fear to finally speak up. And when many voices rise together, collective strength becomes powerful enough to force the system to change. This was no longer the story of a black woman confronting two police officers, but the story of an entire community of a nation reflecting on itself and reshaping its core values. These changes, though unable to completely erase prejudice, laid a solid foundation for a future in which everyone has equal opportunities. Renee, through her story and her actions, left a deep mark on social history, proving that a single act of courage can create limitless ripple effects. And from that point on, the community kept moving forward, not only to honor her victory, but to build a society where justice is no longer a privilege, but an obvious right for all. The reforms sparked by Renee's case did not stop at the initial adjustments, but continued to spread and permeate the functioning of the entire public system. The government, under strong pressure from the public and human rights organizations, implemented mandatory training programs for the entire law enforcement force, focusing on fair conflict resolution skills and on recognizing and eliminating unconscious bias. Other public agencies, from the courts to local governments, also conducted internal reviews to ensure that every process was transparent and left no room for abuse of power. Regular reports were made public, allowing citizens to monitor and provide feedback, thereby rebuilding trust in a system that had been shaken by similar incidents. Alongside this, legal reforms were passed that clarified individual and collective responsibility in cases of violations, ensuring that everyone, regardless of position or title, would be held accountable before the law. These changes did not happen overnight, but they were maintained consistently under close community supervision. Many non-governmental organizations worked with public agencies to establish new professional ethics standards while opening hotlines for citizens to report injustices. The police force, once closed off and difficult to approach, now holds regular meetings with residents to answer questions and hear feedback. These actions significantly reduce the distance and long-standing distrust between the public and law enforcement agencies. The community also became more actively involved in shaping new policies, no longer standing as outsiders to decisions that directly affected their rights and safety. In that context, Renee's story gradually became became a symbol with systemic significance, not just a successfully resolved personal case. She was invited to participate in numerous national and international forums, sharing experiences and lessons from her own journey. Her presence at these events carried particular weight, because Renee spoke not from theory or books, but from real experience and an unshakable belief in justice. Many young people saw in her the image of a woman who refused to yield under pressure, willing to face authority to defend the truth. That very spirit inspired a wave of new movements, from raising awareness about human rights to large-scale policy advocacy campaigns. The conclusion of the story brought a sense of fulfillment, but not closure, because what Renee had initiated continued to grow. The justice system, once criticized for bias and lack of transparency, was forced to publicly acknowledge its mistakes in her case and commit to improvement. That acknowledgement was not merely a symbolic apology, but was demonstrated through concrete actions, from strictly disciplining individuals who violated the law to allocating budgets for long-term reform programs. The community witnessed change, not only on paper, but in everyday life, as public officials began to show more respect and listen more attentively to the people. For Renee, this victory was not simply the clearing of her own name, but a step forward for all those who had suffered injustice without a chance to speak out. She knew there was still much work to do, but at the very least her story had proven that even a single individual, when persistent and steadfast in the belief in justice, could create change on a societal scale. That became a powerful source of encouragement for those still struggling in the shadows, helping them believe that their voices would be heard if they dared to raise them. From a sweltering summer afternoon, when she was treated unfairly on the street, to the moment when the court and the entire systems had to bow their heads and admit wrongdoing, Renee's journey became living proof that justice can be delayed, but with persistence it will come. And so the story concluded within a portrait of a society in the midst of powerful transformation, where injustices once ignored were now exposed, where those once dismissed now had a voice, and where an individual like Renee could stand before a packed hall speaking of justice, not as a distant concept, but as something entirely attainable when everyone works together to defend it. After the incident, its impact did not stop at reforms on paper, but carved deeply into society's understanding of justice and fairness. Many who had once considered acts of racial discrimination within the police force to be isolated incidents were now forced to acknowledge that it was a systemic issue requiring thorough change. Discussions on human rights equality and the responsibility of law enforcement agencies appeared frequently in the media, from mainstream news reports to community forums. Renee, as the central figure in the case, became a symbol tied to that message. People no longer saw her merely as a wrongfully arrested lawyer, but as someone who compelled society to look inward, forcing it to question how people treat one another regardless of skin color, gender, or status. From the image of a black woman calmly facing abuse of power, Renee quickly became a model of steadfastness and courage. What earned her respect was not only the legal victory, but the way she preserved her dignity in circumstances where many others might have broken down or reacted in desperation. Black women whose stories were often forgotten or dismissed began to see in Renee proof that silence does not mean weakness, that self-confidence and self-control can become the strongest weapons in confronting injustice. They learned from her that power does not come only from titles or positions, but from the ability to make the other side reflect on its own actions. The influence of the story extended beyond women in similar circumstances, reaching young people searching for direction in life. Many law students, social activists, and even those not directly connected to the legal field found in Renee an inspiration to persist in pursuing their goals despite difficulties. Universities invited her to speak, sharing lessons on patient strategy and mental strength in the fight for justice. She became a regular guest at major conferences where her voice was valued not only for what she had endured, but for the the way she analyzed and conveyed the lessons drawn from that experience. Within the Black community, Renee became a milestone proof that facing and defeating the system was not impossible. She inspired solidarity, making people realize that every action, no matter how small, could contribute to changing the bigger picture. Social organizations used her story as a prime example in awareness campaigns, encouraging those who had suffered injustice to document, preserve, and make the truth public, as it could be the first step toward turning the situation around. She did not urge others to act exactly as she had, but emphasized that everyone has the right to choose a form of resistance that suits their circumstances, as long as they preserve their dignity and their belief in justice. Renee's presence in social reform movements also helped redefine the concept of personal strength. Instead of relying on noise or instant reactions, she chose the path of patience, gathering evidence, seeking allies, and using the law as a tool to protect herself and her community. This made her an ideal role model for those who believe in the power of intellect and strategy rather than violence. Her story also opened deeper discussions about the role of women in leadership positions and in social movements, showing that they are not merely followers, but can lead, guide, and create meaningful change. Looking back, the lesson Renee left for society was not confined to the legal sphere, but was a reminder of how we treat one another. She proved that a decisive action taken at the right moment can shake an entire system once thought unchangeable. That awakening led many to realize that justice is not a distant concept, but something that must be protected and practiced daily, from the smallest acts in everyday life to major policy decisions. This is what allowed Renee to become not only a role model of her time, but also a guiding light for greater progress in society's future. After all the turmoil, Renee returned to the state attorney's office with an entirely different spirit. The steps she took through the courthouse halls now carried confidence and respect from colleagues, something many had once acknowledged only through her professional achievements. Having endured a harsh confrontation with the system, she understood that her work was not simply about processing files or arguing in court, but about defending even the smallest rights of citizens, especially the vulnerable. Every case, large or small, now carried a deeper meaning and opportunity to prevent similar injustices from happening again. She did not seek the spotlight, but her persistence and composure made her a pillar of support for younger colleagues learning how to stand firm under outside pressure. In the past, Renee had believed that as long as she fulfilled her duties, the system would naturally operate fairly. Now, after her own case, she understood that the system only improves when someone is willing to ask questions, demand accountability, and force it to change. That event instilled in her the belief that a lawyer's true power does not lie in a title card, but in the ability to use knowledge and the law to protect those without a voice. This transformed the way she worked. She became more patient in listening, more forceful in every argument, and unwilling to overlook even the smallest sign of injustice. Interns at the office often heard her say, "Law is not just words on paper, it is the breath of justice. If the law does not protect people, then it needs to be rewritten." Renee herself realized that her story carried meaning far beyond the scope of a single lawsuit. It was living proof that an individual, even when placed in a disadvantaged position, could still compel an entire system to bow to the truth. This inspired not only those pursuing law, but anyone who had ever felt overlooked or dismissed. She became a frequent speaker at legal and human rights conferences where she shared not only her experience confronting injustice, but also how to build a patient, well-founded, and persistent strategy to change reality. These talks were not empty, rousing speeches, but real stories told in a calm yet powerful voice, allowing listeners to feel every moment of confrontation, every tense heartbeat, and even the times when her faith was pushed to its limits. Many young people, after hearing her speak, sought her out to share their own stories, hoping for guidance or simply to find a spark of hope. Renee always listened, never imposing solutions, but guiding them on how to use legal tools and the strength of the community to protect themselves. From her own experience, she learned that power and justice do not always go hand in hand, and that the mission of those in the profession is to bring them together. A strong system without fairness becomes an instrument of oppression, while justice without strength exists only on paper. The balance between these two forces was something she pursued relentlessly, whether in courtrooms, negotiation tables, or closed-door meetings with authorities. She understood that no one can change everything after a single case, but each victory, no matter how small, helps pave the way toward a better reality. Renee also made it clear that justice is not a gift granted by someone, but the result of persistence and collective effort. She encouraged people to take part in this process, from speaking out against wrongdoing to demanding transparency in public decisions. She believed change could only last when people recognized their own power and were willing to use it. For her, everyone had the responsibility not only to defend their own rights, but also to protect the rights of the community, because justice only truly exists when it encompasses everyone. Looking back, she did not see her journey as a chain of luck or coincidence. It was the result of preparation, composure under pressure, and determination never to yield to any wrongdoing. This made her living proof that one person can force an entire system to reflect on itself. And the greatest lesson she left for society was that power does not belong to the loudest voices, but to those patient, courageous, and wise enough to use it in the service of justice. In doing so, Renee not only changed her own life, but also awakened in thousands of others the belief that they too could do the same. Perhaps that very ripple effect was the most valuable legacy she left after her challenging journey. After public pressure and precedent-setting rulings from Renee's case, the police system was forced to reassess its entire structure and methods of operation. New training programs were designed focusing on awareness of racial bias, nonviolent conflict resolution, and communication skills with the community. These training sessions were no longer perfunctory, but required the participation of sociologists, psychologists, and human rights organizations to ensure that every police officer understood their responsibility toward all citizens regardless of skin color, gender, or social class. Alongside training, an independent monitoring system was established with authority to access the records and activity reports of each unit in order to detect and address misconduct before it escalated into tragedy. At first, many officers were uncomfortable with these changes. They argued that constant oversight would hinder their ability to perform their duties and take away the flexibility necessary for the job. However, after the first cases were handled transparently and fairly, a portion of the force began to realize that the new regulations were not meant to restrict them, but to protect both themselves and the public. The recognition of proper conduct and timely rewards also allowed many to see fairness from both sides. This helped senior leadership persuade the force to accept and implement the reforms more seriously. Internal meetings became more frequent, not only between leaders and officers, but also with representatives from the community, lawyers, journalists, and social activists. These dialogues did not shy away from difficult questions, but openly dissected long-standing problems: why incidents of racial discrimination kept recurring, why public complaints were often ignored, and how to restore trust between the police and the community. With each discussion, the gap between the two sides narrowed, giving way to concrete plans and clear commitments to act. One fundamental change was the application of technology to increase transparency. Body cameras became mandatory in most duties, involving public interaction with data stored and deletable only by independent oversight committees. In addition, statistics on arrests, complaints, and disciplinary actions were made public quarterly on the official website, allowing citizens to easily access access and assess them. This both created pressure and encouraged the police force to maintain proper conduct and uphold their image. However, deep change could not happen overnight. Certain conservative groups within the force continued to quietly resist, seeking to delay or undermine the reforms. They argued that the new regulations stripped away the traditional power of the police and put them at greater risk when confronting criminals. In response, senior leaders repeatedly emphasized that real power lay not in the ability to impose, but in the trust of the community. When the public had confidence, the job would become both safer and more effective. Renee, though no longer directly involved in the lawsuit, continued to closely follow the progress of the reforms. She frequently attended workshops and community meetings offering perspectives from both a victim and a legal professional. Her story was used as illustrative material in training programs, reminding participants that a single wrong decision, a single act of abuse of power, could destroy the career and reputation of the force. Her presence at these events was not only symbolic, but also a constant reminder that reform cannot stop at documents. It must be present in every action and every interaction between police and citizens. Gradually, acceptance from police leadership spread to many other ranks. Officers, who had once strongly opposed the changes, began to acknowledge that a transparent and fair work environment reduced stress, limited conflicts with the public, and protected them from false accusations. Complaint rates from citizens decreased, and the number of violent incidents during duty also began to drop. These figures became convincing evidence that reform, though difficult, was the only path to restoring the sector's credibility. From the outside, the community also noticed the change. Citizens became more open to cooperating with the police, willing to share information when they saw fairness in how cases were handled. Social organizations, instead of solely opposing, sought to collaborate by providing resources, organizing joint training sessions, and building bridges between the two sides. The picture of the relationship between police and community, once deeply fractured, was gradually being repaired, though some scars remained hard to erase. These reforms, ultimately, were the result of a painful chain of events sparked by Renee's case. They served as a reminder that justice cannot wait, and every power system must be monitored to ensure it serves its intended purpose. In every meeting, every report, every training session, the image of a black woman once subjected to abuse of power, but who stood up to change the course of events, remained a reminder that fairness is not a distant concept, but a daily responsibility. Human rights organizations, both domestic and international, did not ease their pressure after the initial reforms. They persisted in submitting petitions, holding public hearings, and using the full strength of the media to remind the public that reform cannot stop at promises. They demanded that authorities release regular progress reports detailing steps taken and issues still unresolved. Some organizations even partnered with lawyers and independent investigative journalists to monitor on the ground, ensuring that new regulations were not circumvented or applied superficially. Their constant presence acted like a mirror, forcing leaders and the police force to remain aware that their every action was under close watch. Community pressure did not ease. Monthly town hall meetings were held where residents directly questioned police and government representatives about specific cases. Social activist groups continuously organized workshops, exhibitions, and media campaigns to keep the topic of reform active in public forums. Many schools and universities even incorporated Renee's story into their curricula as a prime example of an individual's measures to change the system. This fostered a younger generation more aware of their rights and equipped to use their voices to defend justice. Beyond improving internal procedures, this pressure pushed lawmakers to consider amending legal provisions related to handling police misconduct. New regulations reduced the degree of legal immunity for excessive actions and increased the authority of independent investigative bodies to pursue criminal accountability. Several states began implementing laws requiring public access to police disciplinary records, enabling citizens to know the behavioral history of those serving their communities. The change affected not only law enforcement, but also extended into the legal system. Prosecutors were required to rigorously review all evidence related to allegations of discrimination or abuse of power. Collaborative programs between courts and social organizations were created to ensure that victims of similar incidents received timely legal and psychological support. This was a major step forward, transforming reform from a set of administrative measures into a structural change, reaching every link in the justice system. Importantly, these changes were designed for long-term sustainability. Regular training sessions, annual evaluations, and citizen feedback mechanisms became mandatory parts of police operations. The use of technology, from transparent data management systems to violation reporting apps, ensured that every action left a trace and could be held accountable. When officers understood there was no longer room for concealment, they were compelled to adjust their behavior from their attitude toward the public to their methods of handling situations. Perhaps the most profound impact was the shift in professional mindset among those serving and those preparing to join the force. New recruits were no longer trained solely in technical skills, but were also required to complete courses on professional ethics, social awareness, and cultural communication. This produced a new generation of police officers expected to place the values of justice and respect for human dignity above all else. From Renee's story, the American legal system witnessed a chain of transformations many had once thought impossible. These reforms did not occur in silence, but were fueled by the unwavering voices of the community and the persistence of human rights organizations. This combination turned what might have been temporary adjustments into the foundation for a fairer system where power was no longer an untouchable privilege but a responsibility monitored and bound by the very people it served. Renee's story spread throughout communities, becoming a flame of inspiration that everyone wanted to preserve. In neighborhoods, coffee shops, schools, and even large auditoriums, her name was spoken as a symbol of courage and justice. In particular, the Black community saw this as a victory, not just for one person, but for an entire group that had endured centuries of injustice. They saw, in Renee's eyes, a reflection of themselves, and in her actions, proof that silence when timed right and a voice when raised at the right moment could shatter a wall of prejudice. Support for her did not stop at praise, but turned into concrete actions. Legal aid funds for victims of racial discrimination were created, and community workshops were held to share the strategies for protecting personal rights when facing abuse of power. From this foundation, numerous social movements gained momentum. Advocacy campaigns, which had previously existed in a fragmented way, now found a focal point to gather and grow. Renee's story became a catalyst for Black Lives Matter activists to intensify their efforts, organizing large-scale protests in cities across the country. Street after street was filled with banners bearing her image alongside slogans calling for an end to racial discrimination in law enforcement. The atmosphere of these marches was not only charged with outrage, but also infused with hope for a fairer future. Discussions on social reform also became more vibrant than ever. From Congress and local councils to online forums, Renee's case was repeatedly cited as a defining example, forcing people to re-examine the power structure and imbalance within the legal system. Many politicians, scholars, and lawyers used it to push for new bills on police oversight, improved investigative procedures, and stronger protections for victims. Some states even incorporated this case into civics education programs, aiming to equip the younger generation with a clearer understanding of their rights and responsibilities. At universities, students formed specialized research groups on social justice, using this case as a starting point for analysis, debate, and solution building. Panel discussions drew large audiences from students and professors to veteran activists. Here, not only was Renee's story told, but also countless others from people who had suffered injustice yet remained unknown to the public. This helped the public realize that her case was merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. The influence extended beyond borders. International media reported on it, and human rights organizations in multiple countries sent congratulations and expressed admiration. Some nations even invited Renee to participate in global conferences on justice and human rights, where she shared experiences and lessons from her case. Her presence on the international stage transformed the story from a local incident into a global message about resilience and the power of the individual against the system. Artists, writers, and filmmakers also found inspiration in this story. They composed music, wrote novels, and produced documentaries, weaving Renee's image into the fabric of contemporary cultural heritage. These works not only recreated the events, but also conveyed profound messages about human dignity, faith in justice, and the ability of each individual to alter an order that had stood for centuries. All these responses, from the community's enthusiastic support to the ensuing movements and campaigns, proved one thing: Renee's story did not stop at bringing a wrongful police officer to justice. It became a turning point, a foundation for society to recognize that fairness is not a distant ideal, but the result of persistence, unity, and the courage to confront injustice. And once that flame was lit, it would keep burning, guiding new struggles that were stronger and more far-reaching. The resonance of Renee's case did not remain on American streets, but quickly spread internationally. Major human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and many other civil society alliances issued statements urging nations to seriously review and reform their police forces. They cited this story as vivid proof that if left unsupervised and unreformed, law enforcement systems could become tools for perpetuating injustice instead of protecting justice. Special reports were released calling for the adoption of transparency standards, independent oversight mechanisms, and anti-racism awareness training for all law enforcement personnel. International human rights conferences began dedicating specific discussion sessions to this issue, with participation from numerous scholars, experts, and government representatives. Politicians from local to national levels could not remain on the sidelines. Some legislators proposed bills to increase community oversight over the police, while tightening disciplinary measures for abuses of power. On public platforms, many leaders admitted they had once ignored warnings from human rights organizations, and that Renee's case was a wake-up call, forcing them to act. Election campaigns also began placing police reform at the center, promising to minimize racially biased actions and to build a law enforcement force that was both strong and fair. These developments created a chain reaction, shifting public perception within communities. Citizens, long accustomed to seeing police as an absolute security force, began to view them in a more realistic and nuanced way. They understood that unchecked power could easily lead to abuse, and that the police must be held accountable like any other public institution. Conversations in families' classrooms and workplaces began focusing on the true role of the police and the boundary between necessary authority and abused power. Renee's story became the catalyst for many people to explore for the first time the inner workings of law enforcement agencies. Community workshops were organized, inviting legal experts, sociologists, and even former police officers to analyze and find ways to improve the system. Many attendees shared that they had never considered the presence of implicit bias in police procedures until this case exposed it so clearly. The media played a major role in this process. Articles, investigative reports, and television programs continuously examined the story from multiple angles, helping the public see not just an isolated incident, but the broader picture of racial discrimination within the system. Images of Renee, from the moment she faced the police to the moment she achieved her legal victory, became symbols of the confrontation between the individual and authority. The shift in public awareness led to concrete actions. Many localities established independent oversight committees, giving citizens a direct voice in evaluating and monitoring police operations. Schools added lessons on civic rights and social justice, teaching the younger generation that power and responsibility must always go hand in hand. Businesses also began participating in reform efforts, funding community initiatives aimed at building healthier relationships between police and the public. Gradually, a widely accepted truth emerged: to truly serve the community, the police must be a force not only capable of protection but also bound by ethical standards and transparent mechanisms. And it was Renee's story that brought millions of people, ordinary citizens and politicians alike from across the country and around the world, together to reflect and search for a path toward change. Renee had long been accustomed to working in courtrooms, facing tough cases and formidable legal opponents, but she had never imagined she would become the focal point of a wide-reaching social movement. After the incident, her image was no longer confined to that of a state attorney, but had become a living symbol of resilience and an unyielding will in the face of injustice. Legal journals, major newspapers, and national television programs continually invited her for interviews, not only to hear her speak about the law, but to learn how one individual could compel an entire system to change. Every seminar where Renee appeared was filled to capacity. People admired not only her sharp analytical skills, but also her composure and confident demeanor when speaking about her personal experiences. She did not shy away from unpleasant memories, nor did she embellish them into triumphs, but recounted them with honesty, so that others could understand that true strength comes from confronting the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Her presence at these events inspired the belief that a single individual, if courageous and steadfast enough, could become the catalyst for a wave of change. Renee's story quickly spread across all social media platforms. Videos of hearings and intense debates in which she participated went viral, accompanied by captions such as "This is what justice looks like" or "One woman against the system." Many who had never heard of Renee before, after seeing these images, began to research her, read about the case, and realize that her story was not merely a personal incident, but an example of a long battle against prejudice and unjust power structures. Beyond inspiring others, Renee became a voice for those who had been discriminated against or abused but had never had the chance to speak out. She began collaborating with human rights organizations, agreeing to advise on cases where victims lacked access to legal resources. Each time she stood before people in desperate circumstances, she was reminded of why she could not stop. Those faces were a constant reminder that justice cannot remain just words on paper. At community forums, Renee often shared small stories, sometimes absent from the news, but carrying profound lessons. She spoke of meeting ordinary citizens, the simple words of thanks they offered her, or the look in a child's eyes upon hearing that justice was something that could protect them. Each story became part of a larger message that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, has the right to demand respect and protection from the legal system. Within the legal community, Renee was mentioned as a rare example of seamlessly combining professional expertise with social influence. Many of her colleagues, even those long in the profession, admitted that the recent events had changed how they viewed their work. Some became more involved in community activities, while others resolved to push for reform within the institutions they serve. What was remarkable was that despite being honored in many places, Renee never placed herself in the position of an invincible hero. She always emphasized that this victory was the result of collective effort from those who recorded videos, the witnesses who dared to testify in court, to the communities that relentlessly pressured the system. In her view, if this story inspired people, it was inspiration about the power of collective strength, not about a single individual. Renee also understood that becoming a symbol meant she would face greater scrutiny, and even criticism from those who disagreed with her. But instead of avoiding it, she chose to face it directly. In panel discussions, when questioned about her views, she responded candidly, grounding her answers in the law and the ethical principles she believed in. That consistency earned her respect even from some who had once opposed her. Whenever Renee stepped onto a stage, whether before thousands or just a few dozen in a small meeting room, the atmosphere shifted. People listened not only because her story was compelling, but because her voice carried real experience and a firm belief that justice was attainable. Every word she spoke reminded listeners that injustice would always exist somewhere, but if enough people spoke out and acted, it could never endure forever. From a quiet, working attorney, Renee had stepped into the role of a national symbol, not because she sought fame, but because she chose to stand when many others chose silence. That choice made her story a source of inspiration not only for the present, but also for future generations who would continue the pursuit of justice she had steadfastly begun. Support from international organizations for Renee did not stop at symbolic statements, but was made tangible through partnerships, funding, and policy advocacy. Many of the world's leading human rights organizations sent representatives to meet her directly to learn more about the case and to connect her story with global anti-racism campaigns. International human rights forums began including Renee's case in their discussions, treating it as vivid proof that injustice was not confined to one nation but was a systemic issue requiring cross-border cooperation and solidarity to change. Special reports, online conferences, and multilingual media campaigns were rolled out to pressure governments and law enforcement agencies in many places to review their operational procedures and oversight mechanisms. This support ensured that Renee's story was not limited to one local community or even one nation, but became part of a global wave for change. The backing of international organizations behind Renee also sent a powerful message that justice knows no borders. Any act of discrimination, no matter where it occurs, is a shared threat to human dignity. The campaigns they coordinated focused not only on policing, but also extended into areas such as education, healthcare, and labor, aiming to ensure that equal rights were applied comprehensively. This network also opened many opportunities for Renee to take part in global projects, from policy consulting to training community groups on how to document, report, and respond to incidents of abuse of power. At the same time, Renee realized that her influence lay not only in her ability to drive policy change, but also in directly inspiring the younger generation. She regularly visited schools and youth clubs where eager and curious young faces listened to her every word. Renee told them about her journey, about the moments when she felt most alone, yet chose to keep going, and about her belief that one strong voice can awaken hundreds or thousands more. She encouraged them to ask questions, to challenge what was unjust, and not to let fear prevent them from acting. In her talks, Renee did not speak in slogans, but used her personal experiences as proof. She recounted the long days of facing public pressure, the nearly sleepless nights spent preparing for court, and the relief she felt when justice was finally served. What impressed young people was how she turned pain into strength, and the fact that she was far from perfect, yet persisted to the end. These stories made many realize for the first time that standing up against injustice was not some distant act, but something that could start with the smallest actions in daily life. Many young people, after meeting Renee, decided to join community groups, volunteer programs, or enroll in law or sociology programs with the hope of one day contributing to meaningful change. Some even wrote letters to her sharing how her story had helped them regain the confidence to overcome the prejudices they faced. Renee always read those letters with appreciation, knowing that her greatest impact was not in the spotlight or in the prestigious awards, but in touching hearts and sparking action in each person. The combination of pressure from international organizations and the spirit Renee instilled in the next generation created a sustainable circle of influence. Policy changes were reinforced by a generation of young citizens who clearly understood the value of justice and equality. Renee's story was no longer just a symbolic case, but had become part of the collective memory, a source of strength for anyone fighting injustice anywhere in the world. Above all, it affirmed that one person willing to say enough in the face of injustice can pave the way for millions to follow, turning belief into reality. Reforms within the entire law enforcement system began to spread like a chain reaction, reaching far beyond the city where Renee's story took place. Police departments in many states reviewed their entire operational procedures, from recruitment and training to how situations involving minority communities were handled. Mandatory training on racial awareness and justice was implemented for all personnel, focusing not only on theory but also on realistic scenario-based exercises to help officers develop appropriate responses. At the same time, independent monitoring systems were established to ensure these changes existed not just on paper, but truly influenced the behavior of each individual in the force. Transparent monthly reports were made public, allowing citizens to track and evaluate the reform process, making community oversight an inseparable part of police operation. In parallel, public agencies also examined themselves, reassessing policies that had intentionally or unintentionally allowed discrimination and abuse of power to persist. National-level forums were organized, bringing together legal experts, social activists, and community representatives to find comprehensive solutions. Many cities tested new intervention models where police worked alongside social workers and psychologists in addressing incidents involving community disputes or mental health crises. This was seen as an important step forward, reducing the risk of escalating tensions and creating a more humane approach to maintaining order. Renee's story from an individual incident had become a central part of a broader dialogue about fairness in society. The media, universities, and community forums all referenced her name as a symbol of personal strength and the ability to change an entire system. People began to understand that justice was not only about punishing wrongdoers, but also about building an environment where everyone was equally protected. Many recognized that real change required both steadfast individual action and systemic reform, and that it was this combination that had the power to dismantle long-standing structures of injustice. From small neighborhoods to political centers, people engaged in lively discussions about the rights and responsibilities of citizens and how each person could contribute to maintaining a fair legal system. Community groups began organizing more basic legal training sessions, teaching citizens how to protect their rights when interacting with law enforcement. This proactive approach made the concept of justice more accessible, no longer something abstract, but a tangible part of everyday life. Renee, while continuing her work as a state attorney, had stepped into a new role. She became a bridge between the community and policymakers, frequently participating in hearings to ensure that the voices of those once overlooked were heard. She did not seek the spotlight, but her presence in meetings and forums always carried a special weight. Whenever Renee spoke, listeners could sense that hers was not the voice of a distant public figure, but of someone who had once stood in the center of a storm of injustice and found her way into the light. The reach of this story also brought about a profound change in how society viewed similar incidents. When an act of abuse of power occurred anywhere, people no longer remained silent and waited, but quickly documented, reported, and demanded answers from the authorities. The spirit of "no one stands on the sidelines" became the guiding principle for many community movements, and this was what helped sustain the momentum for reform. Ultimately, the reforms did not remain as a temporary reaction to a high-profile case, but became a new foundation for how the justice system operated. Though the road ahead still held many challenges, society had taken a significant step toward greater transparency and equality. And within all these shifts, Renee's image remained a powerful reminder that even a solitary individual could spark a wave of seismic change, so long as they dared to face the truth and stood firm in defending what was right. Human rights organizations, after what they had witnessed in Renee's case, moved beyond a reactive role to become proactive watchdogs, persistently monitoring every step taken by public institutions. They established independent reporting channels, encouraged citizens to speak up when facing injustice, and called on governments to conduct regular inspections to ensure that announced reforms were maintained and applied in practice. Their presence was not only a form of political pressure, but also a constant reminder that fairness cannot exist without oversight and transparency. Hearings, annual reports, and community forums all featured their participation, making the voices of marginalized groups an integral part of the reform process. That persistence forced government agencies to acknowledge the importance of working with human rights organizations. No longer was there room for abuses of power to quietly occur behind closed doors. Instead, a multi-layered oversight mechanism was put in place where every decision could be questioned and required to be justified before the public. This way of operating created a new foundation for justice, one in which power was not concentrated in the hands of a few, but distributed and kept in check through the broad participation of society. In this context, Renee's story became a symbol that extended beyond the original incident. The image of her standing firm under pressure, determined to fight until the end, touched the hearts of millions. It was not only proof of one individual's victory over injustice, but also a statement that a system can change when those within it dare to confront it and hold it accountable. Each time, the story was retold, whether on a political stage, in a classroom, or through community campaigns, it reignited the belief that justice is not a luxury, but an inherent right for all. This influence reached beyond borders as international organizations, scholars, and activists from many countries sought out Renee to share experiences and learn how she had turned a painful ordeal into a force for reform. Her name appeared in research on social justice, becoming a leading example of the union between individual strength and community support in dismantling long-entrenched structures of injustice. When the story came to a close, no one saw Renee merely as a woman who had won a lawsuit. She was a reminder that real change requires both individual courage and collective strength. Justice was restored not only through a verdict, but through the way reforms were sustained. Lessons were deeply ingrained, and voices once ignored now rang out stronger than ever. From this point on, Renee would remain a part of the history of justice and human rights, a symbol showing that even within the most complex and unjust systems, there is always room for truth and for light to prevail.